If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. If you've been following this podcast, then you know that we have a regular feature called Church Chats with Ed, where my Protestant friend Ed and I chat about the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. Well, today I'm launching a new periodic feature with another friend of mine, Cory Licatos. You've met Cory before in some earlier episodes. He and I worked together at the Lakeshore Academy for the New Evangelization, or LANE. Cory is our Director of Communications and also leads our family ministry, what we call LANE Families. We've known each other for many years, and we both entered the Catholic Church as converts at the same time. We also both love reading, and we worked together for a while in publishing. And so we end up having a lot of conversations about books, particularly fiction. In fact, reading Catholic fiction and talking about those novels was one way that our roads to Rome converged. So, we thought that we'd share our passion for Catholic stories with you in a new regular segment that we're going to call simply Book Club. In this first installment of Book Club, we talked about what, exactly, makes a story Catholic. Shh! It's time for Book Club. So, Cory, we are starting a new feature here on the podcast, and we're going to call it Book Club.
Excellent. It's always exciting to start a book club.
Now, let's distinguish a little bit what we're going to kind of do here. This is book club, not book reviews. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So with a book review, we'd be saying, hey, here's this book, and then we're not giving you any spoilers, but we give it, 5 stars or, whatever the deal is. Here, we're actually going to discuss the book. So,
right. So if you haven't read the book that we're talking about, either be comfortable with spoilers, because we'll talk about things that are important and relevant, or read the book first.
Yeah. Or just pick up on some of the themes. I mean, we're not going to... What I'd like to do is kind of not presume that the listener has read the book. Because there's a lot of books that we're going to talk about here that some are very popular, some are maybe more obscure. And I'm going to assume that a lot of our people haven't read it. And I don't want them to go, well, I don't need to listen to that episode. Because what I want to make sure that we do when we're talking about them is kind of unpack a little bit, the basic plot or the basic story and talk about the parts of the story that we think are interesting or relevant. And if you've not read the book, you'll still be able to get value from that by just sort of, getting the gist of the story, what it's about, what the important points were. And maybe that intrigues you enough to actually,
pick it up.
Read the book. Yeah. Right. Okay. So the second piece of housekeeping here on this is we are recording this outside. So we're doing our book club in nature here at the One Whirling Adventure secret compound. So you may occasionally hear a chirping bird or a squawking crow or a dive-bombing pterodactyl or whatever. And if you hear any screaming and the microphone goes blank, then avenge us. But the third piece is let's talk a little bit about the premise of the kinds of books we're going to talk about. So this is the Considering Catholicism podcast. It's the Considering Catholicism book club. So we're assuming we're going to talk about Catholic books, and specifically we're going to talk about Catholic novels,
right?
Not nonfiction. And as we're talking about Catholic novels, it raises this interesting question, which is what makes a novel Catholic?
Right.
And I mean, this is a long conversation too. Even when I think when we were both Protestants and evangelicals, what made a book Christian? What made a novel Christian or not Christian, or a movie Christian or not Christian? But now we're taking that even to a sort of a narrower band, and we're saying what makes a novel a Catholic, specifically a Catholic novel. And so we've talked a little bit about this offline, but let's maybe kind of share some thoughts for for our listeners. So I'm going to throw out kind of maybe a one way to think about it, and then you tell me what you think. But I want to think about like a spectrum.
Okay.
And I don't know how many gradation points are on the spectrum, but maybe at one end of the spectrum, you have a novel that is, I'm going to call explicitly Catholic. So in other words, it's got Catholic characters and plot lines in it. So it's about priests and bishops or popes, and it's about church stuff. It's specifically, the plot is around that. And then moving maybe sort of to the middle of the spectrum, you would have what I might call implicitly Catholic books, in which there are some Catholic plot points or some Catholic characters, but maybe it's got a more general topic, plot. Maybe it's got characters that are not Catholic, right? But it's implicitly Catholic in as much as it deals with Catholic themes or Catholic faith topics, right? And then maybe at the other end of the spectrum, you have what I'm going to call novels that are imbued with a Catholic worldview. And so there are no Catholic characters. There's no churches in it. There's no, explicitly Catholic stuff in it. But this sort of Catholic worldview imbues it. And it's, in a sense, filled with that, or that's a subtext or a foundation. So anyway, that's maybe one way that at least I think of it, and that all those kinds of novels can be Catholic in that one of those senses.
Right. That makes sense to me as one way to think about it. I would kind of build on that by separating out two different qualities that I think were implicit in what you said. One is, for lack of a better term, portrayal of Catholic stuff. So how visible the church and the things of Catholicism are in the book, from one end to that's what it's all about, to the other end if it doesn't appear explicitly. And you could think of that as one axis, maybe your x-axis on a grid. And then your other axis, the y-axis, going in the opposite direction, could be how faithful it is to a Catholic worldview and to Catholic beliefs and doctrines. So we could think of novels that portray Catholic things explicitly and are faithful to kind of the ethos of the church and the teachings of Christ. We could also think of novels that have lots of priests and bishops and popes and completely are unfaithful to what Christ and his church actually say and are all about.
Right.
And I think that would go down all the way down the spectrum to the other end you were talking about, where there are books that don't explicitly show Catholic stuff, but the heart of them is Catholic. So you could plot things all over a graph like that.
Right. I mean, maybe a word for that is Orthodox. And it seems to me that something can be, at least in this context, can be what we might call like subjectively Orthodox or objectively Orthodox. And what I mean by that is, like, okay, so let's suppose an author's writing a book and it's got Catholic stuff in it. And he sort of mentions things or develops plot points or makes commentary or whatever that sort of checks the boxes of, yes, that's an Orthodox belief. That's an Orthodox, right?
It may or may not be a good novel, but yeah.
But it's sort of objectively Orthodox.
Right.
But there's another way, maybe it's about the subjectivity, which is the author's bias.
Okay.
Right? Like, in other words, he just kind of constructs things in such a way that it sort of makes the church look bad.
Sure.
Right? And we'll give some examples here in a moment. But I mean, I've read, I personally think that the problem with most people is that they know almost everything they think they know about the Middle Ages is wrong.
Right.
Because their only source of information about the Middle Ages is largely Hollywood. And Hollywood portrays the church, and it portrays the Middle Ages and the church in the Middle Ages in a biased fashion. And some of that is sort of like objectively, like, but some of it's just sort of implicit. Like, you cast a character, say, in a movie, And if you'll notice, all of the monks or priests or whatever are ugly. They're like physically unattractive people. And so you'll just kind of go, wow, here's the handsome, humanist guy. Galileo is played by like some male model. And then all of the guys who are persecuting Galileo in the movie are all like ugly and they have deformed faces. And they, shuffle around. They have bad breath and their teeth are all rotten. And, that's not even a very subtle thing, but it goes to the author's bias.
Mm-hmm.
So I like your scheme of, adding sort of that y-axis. But so let's to help our listeners to imagine. Let's just mention some books that maybe occupy some of these spaces. So give me an example of an explicitly Catholic novel.
Something explicit that I've read in the last few years. Not a super well-known author, but Robert Hugh Benson wrote a novel called The Lord of the World, which is it was written near the beginning of the 20th century, but it's a dystopian novel about, I think it takes place in 2019 or something. About
do they have flying cars?
They do. It's great.
We never got our flying cars.
No, that's the only good thing about this imagined future is the flying cars. But yeah, it's all about church politics and the relations of church and state in this kind of dystopian, apocalyptic imagined future. And it's both completely about the things of the church and explicitly trying to be faithful to the teachings of the church.
Right. That's a great one. That's a fantastic example. Another one that we might think of, or at least in that explicitly Catholic thing, are the Father Brown mysteries.
Sure, yeah, Chesterton.
Chesterton's Father Brown mysteries, where the detective is a Catholic priest, right? And a lot of the plot lines involve the church. Another one that we're going to talk about in an upcoming episode is Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory.
Right.
Oh, and for that matter, Shizuko Endo's Silence.
Yeah.
Both which are about priests and about the persecution of priests. So those will all be sort of like explicitly Catholic books.
Right.
But then again, all of those can sort of exist on this y-axis of how faithful they are or not. And so when we get into that, because we're going to do an episode where we compare Greene's Power and the Glory to Endo's Silence, sort of a tale of two priests. And what I would argue is that Greene is on that Orthodox y-axis. It's a sort of an Orthodox view, and Endo is a sort of less than Orthodox view, maybe below the midline. Well, when we get to that episode,
I have thoughts about that too, but
well, I can't wait.
We'll talk about it then.
We'll hash them out then. Okay, so then let's talk about the ones that are sort of implicitly. And you and I were talking about this before we started the recorder, and if you look at Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the book itself, by the way, is like longer than the Bible.
Yeah, I still need to actually read the book. I'm a big fan of the musical.
It's like longer than Moby Dick. It's insane. It's an insane.
It's one of those 19th century bricks.
I tried to plow through it and got about 3/4 the way through one time, but it's like 1,000 pages long or something crazy. But of course the Broadway show and the movie is what most people know.
Right.
And I would say that the novel is more explicitly Catholic, Hugo's novel. It's not exclusively, but it's more explicitly. But the Broadway show and the film, which most people have seen or are more familiar with, is more implicitly Catholic. In other words, there's the character of the bishop, and there, and Jean Valjean, hides in a convent. And so there are some Catholic characters, but there's a lot of non-Catholic characters, a lot of non-Catholic plot points. But implicitly, sort of Catholic faith runs through it.
Right.
It provides the motivation for Jean Valjean and so forth.
And the themes are deeply Catholic and deeply Christian, even if it's not explicitly like what's driving the plot of the novel.
Right. So I was sharing with you earlier that in another example in that vein maybe is Ken Follett's Pillar of the Earth series, or Pillars of the Earth series. So when I first picked that book up like 10 years ago, I was super excited because I've been studying medieval history since college. I love church architecture and, Gothic architecture. And I loved Ken Follett's spy novels. I'd read, 4 or 5, 6 of his spy novels. Great, real exciting spy novel author. And he was going to do books about things I love, like, building of cathedrals in the Middle Ages. And I was just deeply disappointed in the book because while there was all of this stuff about, building a cathedral and all the characters were Catholic and all this stuff, he had an anti-Catholic bias that really runs through it. And it just kind of turned me off. And I never read the second or third book in the series, kind of because I was just like, the whole thing was like, well, they're building this cathedral, but they're all corrupt and stupid and, and everything else. And the only good characters are the ones who don't really believe in Catholicism and,
Sure. Or everybody's heard of like Dan Brown's novels, Da Vinci Code and all that.
I got to tell you a little story. I went to, I led a pilgrimage group to Italy once. And, on one of the pilgrim trips to Italy, and there was a guy great guy, faithful Catholic guy and all that stuff, but he'd read the Da Vinci Code and all this stuff, and he was into it. And so the whole time we're walking around Rome, he's like looking for all these like Da Vinci Code things, and I'm like, dude, they're not here. And he's like, well, what do you mean? Like in the Da Vinci Code, it says when we're in the Sistine Chapel, there's this thing. And I'm like, it's not there. And he goes, but it's in the book. And I go, right.
It's fiction.
He made it up. Like that doesn't exist. And he goes, well, but how could the publisher like just make stuff up? I don't know. Because they were printing money. They were literally printing money by making stuff up. So, so there's all these kinds of things where, okay. And then we get to this sort of the other end of that spectrum with the X and Y axis we were talking about, with things that are imbued with Catholicism,
but don't explicitly portray it.
Yeah, and it just sort of is a background. And so there's some books there that we're going to be talking about coming up, which is the first episode after next episode here, the first book club, we're going to be talking about the works of Jrr Tolkien.
Right, which is the classic example of that part of the spectrum.
It's all about like hobbits with furry feet and swords and dragons and a bunch of weird stuff. And there's no priests or churches or anything else in it, but it's often been called, Lord of the Rings, often called perhaps the greatest Catholic novel of the 20th century, and it doesn't have any Catholicism in it. So, and also another one that I hope that we're going to be talking about soon is Mary Shelley's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Bram Stoker's. We're going to talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula, but also Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And Frankenstein is not an explicitly Catholic book, but it's imbued with Catholic worldview.
Right. Well, neither Shelley nor Stoker were Catholics.
Right.
But yeah, the kind of the underpinnings, the philosophical and theological underpinnings of those books deeply resonate with Christianity and with the Catholic Church.
Okay, so this is our hermeneutic or our schema for how we're approaching book club here. And then I think the last question for some of our maybe listeners is, what's the criteria for why we're choosing? Well, it has to be Catholic somewhere on that grid. We're probably going to not talk about the ones that are sort of anti-Catholic.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to hear a Da Vinci Code
No, we're not going to do a
episode.
Da Vinci book club episode. But we're going to talk about Endo's silence, and we can have a vigorous debate about how orthodox or unorthodox that is. But nevertheless, I think the criteria is no more complicated than they're the books that we feel like talking about.
Well, they have to be interesting, in addition to being Catholic.
Right. I mean, I worked in Christian publishing, and for a major Christian publisher, and for a while, and so I know that there's a gazillion books out there, and publishers are in the business of putting out, and there's a lot of great Catholic authors, current Catholic authors, people who are doing fantastic creative work, even self-publishing. There's just a lot of good stuff out there, and we can't review it all, and some of it just is more interesting to you and I than others, and so we bring our own subjective bias to it in terms of what kind of spins our, we're both guys. I don't read a lot of chick lit, so I'm not that I'm opposed to that. But typically the books that we're going to talk about are ones that are sort of interesting to us.
Yeah. You got to acknowledge that. If somebody wants to write in and tell us why we should review Jane Austen or something, knock yourself out. Yeah. There's
Catholic romance novels out there.
Oh, certainly.
There's all kinds of stuff,
I read one published actually by a friend recently. That
I know
was
the one
very,
you're talking
that
about.
was very
You
good.
can drop a mention.
Yeah. No, actually, maybe we should do that one at some point. I'm thinking of In Pieces. The author is Rhonda Ortiz.
Yeah. We both know Rhonda.
Yeah, yeah. She's a local where we live.
Well,
so
maybe we could have Rhonda on book club sometime.
Yeah, that'd
and
be
she
great.
could talk about her book. But
and that's not a genre that I read very much, but
Well,
I very much enjoyed her
I mean,
book.
I respect Rhonda, and she's a good friend of ours, and it's a great book. It's not, like, to your point, it's not the genre of thing that I typically pick up, but that's not any kind of an indictment of the quality of the book. It's so basically you're going to get the subjectivity of the books that we sort of like are interested in, feel like talking about. Yeah,
well, and I would add also just hopefully we pick things that are high quality, like things that are worth reading, whatever the opinion may be on them.
And I think ones too that maybe are I don't know what, like emblematic or archetypal.
Sure.
We're going to talk about some ones that I think are great sort of archetypes of Catholic novels.
Sort of representative.
Representative of sort of types and categories and big ideas. And so we're going to go all over the place. We're going to talk about some historical fiction. We're going to talk about some fantasy. We're going to talk about some Catholic science fiction. We've got all kinds of stuff that we're going to sort of be bouncing around. And so hopefully it's going to be a lot of fun. And yeah, this is going to be book club, so we'll plow right in.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thanks, Cory.
Yep.
Thank you for listening. My name is Greg Smith. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with others. And if you're curious about the Catholic worldview and faith, the Church and its saints, or Catholic history, culture, and art, then visit consideringcatholicism.com. And email me to let me know what you think. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com.